Hi everyone, Karl here. I thought I'd record a little video talking about my recent reads here. Since this year I wanted to start a little reading project focusing on experimental German-speaking literature, especially by often overlooked or underappreciated writers. And how the idea came about was last summer I participated in a book club hosted by Andre from the great blog The Untranslated, where we read Schattenfroh by Michael Lenz from 2018. This very unique doorstopper, which was an incredible reading experience. And it got me curious about how much daring and innovative writers and books there are in my mother tongue that I either haven't gotten around to yet or didn't even know about before. So I went down a little rabbit hole of researching names and lines of influence, asked people more knowledgeable than me on the topic, and I got a good idea about whose work I want to tackle. And since I read Ulysses last year as well, and am currently working very slowly, working my way through Finnegan's Wake and the German translation attempts, I thought I'd take Joyce's influence on German-speaking writers as the starting point for this journey, and maybe record a few videos along the way. So, in this one I ramble about my experience with Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Döblin, The Death of Virgil by Hermann Broch, and Perodia by Henny, Jahnn, among others by them. And since I didn't go for a close chronological comparative reading, but we'll talk about my reading experience with these books here in the order that I read them in, the Joyce influence is just a loose framework and point of orientation for me anyway. So, Ulysses was published in 1922 and the German translation in 27. Well, the most common techniques, a lot of books that get compared to it are, of course, the stream of consciousness narration, as in the Penelope chapter, the non-linearity of time or its subjectivity, and when it comes to content, not shying away from descriptions of the vulgar, dirty aspects of life and the body. And another interesting aspect is the role of the outsider and the question of home and belonging. The Jew Leopold Bloom experiences anti-Semitism in Dublin, and all three writers lived in exile at one or multiple points in their lives. Broch and Döblin because they were born to Jewish families too and had to flee from the Nazis, obviously. And the pacifist Jahnn stayed in Norway during the First World War and in Denmark during the Second. Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Döblin is very often referred to as the German Ulysses. It was published in 1929, 2 years after the German translation of Ulysses, but Döblin had already written a quarter of it when he came across Joyce. And interestingly, the translation of Manhattan Transfer by John Dos Passos, another big city novel, was translated in the same year as Ulysses, but Döblin came across both books around the same time. And he published a praising review of Ulysses in 1928, but was later on disappointed by just how much Joyce's influence on Berlin Alexanderplatz was always stressed, as well as readers looking more at his stylistic innovations rather than his social critique. And I can understand that, but I don't blame him for being amazed by its innovation. He said that he didn't need to copy anyone because he just used the language around him, the Berlin dialect, and he had more than enough experience as a psychiatrist to work with. So when people talk about Ulysses, they sometimes equate it with a hard book, grand achievement that takes a lot of effort to get through. And Berlin Alexanderplatz is experimental in that it uses montages and multiple points of view. There are many digressions, insertions of mythological and biblical nature that frame the text, as well as intertextual references, but it's just so readable as well, very engaging book. Just a few words on the plot. Franz Bieberkopf, the main protagonist, served 4 years in prison for the manslaughter of his former girlfriend, and he is determined to live a better life now. He doesn't want to descend back into Berlin's underground of crime, prostitution, alcohol, and the book depicts his fight with an outside force that appears to be stronger than the human will. And in the end, it's of course impossible to stay away from the dark. And it seems that every time Bieberkopf builds something up, it gets torn down. He gets up from a heavy blow only to be dealt an even heavier one, and he feels the grip of the whore of Babylon and the sharp knife of death who even appear personally towards the end, the horror and death. And the novel paints an intriguing picture of Berlin, mostly it's underground of course, and the city is on the one hand of course indifferent to the suffering of the individual, but with all its montages and by allowing us to take part in the lives of people and their struggles we only meet for a few pages, Döblin doesn't ever lose touch with the human, but he still uses a lot of irony, and Bieberkopf is in no way an innocent character in a perverted world. So you have a whole lot of interplay between heavily expressionistic language and dialect, and the camera, so to speak, pans in very closely and out to get a wider picture, and it seems to be understandable how there have been numerous film adaptations. To give you an impression of the insertions, there's a passage I really like where Döblin inserts the narration of Franz Bieberkopf's day with a very detailed description of all the processes in the slaughterhouse, the journey of the cattle written in the second person, only to interrupt that then for a few pages with an alternate interpretation of the Book of Job. And later on there's a scene where Death and the Whore of Babylon themselves appear, as I mentioned, and some of my favorite instances are when the perspective shifts away and focuses on random strangers and tells the struggle on a handful of pages, like a man standing on the street who doesn't have the courage to walk up the stairs to his apartment where his wife is waiting because they just lost their newborn child, or a couple who are lured into criminal activity, and these insertions always stay very close to the human. The narration is very well done in general, as there are instances when strangers get on the tram and you are told when and how they will die, or when someone delivers a letter and you are told the content, backstory and so on. So altogether it's fast-paced, disturbing, sad, it's funny too, and I can't imagine what it must have been like to come across it in the 20s. I don't know if I've given you a good idea about it at all, but it's a great read. Wir wissen, was wir wissen, wir haben's teuer bezahlen müssen. Now, sadly, Döblin is only really known for Berlin Alexanderplatz, and I'm interested in taking a look at his other works and how their styles or degrees of experimentation differ. And this one here, Berge, Meere und Giganten, Mountains, Seas and Giants in the English translation. This, for example, is a science fiction novel set between the 21st and the 28th century without conjunctions or punctuation in enumerations. And I read a short description of it, of a thunderstorm, that might give you a good idea. Drohendes Murren, Rollen, Strudeln, Gurgeln, Klatschen, Schlingern, Schlenkern, Bersten, Zerknattern, Zerschellen, loderndes Zerknallen unter der wolkenverhüllten Sonne, Plätschern, Peitschen, Schwingen an der Sonne, Aufheben in der Wärme, Aufdunsten, Schmelzen, wolkiges Vergehen an der weißen, hochstrahlenden Sonne. What a writer Döblin was. Hermann Broch read Joyce while working on his trilogy The Sleepwalkers in 1930, and in 1938 Joyce was one of the people who helped Broch get a visa for Great Britain after the Anschluss, and Thomas Mann and Albert Einstein helped him then emigrate to the US. That was after Broch was arrested by the Gestapo for a few weeks, and during the arrest he had to face the very real topic of death and the preparation for it, which is the main aspect of The Death of Virgil. The book was published in 1945 in both English and German at the same time in New York. It is often, probably rightfully so, described as prose poetry, but an interesting structural aspect is that sometimes the paragraphs really do break open into verse, and in other instances into these aphoristic, I guess, bullet points, but they are very realistic and cynical passages too. So you might know that in German it's quote-unquote grammatically legal to stack nouns and adjectives together to a compound chain, and Brochs make heavy use of this. And because of that, the words and long-winded sentences have a very high density, are very intensive. It seems like there's almost no plain description, because on top of the compounds you have a whole lot of pleonasms, so it's never just dark, but a dark darkness, a blind blindness and so on. And sometimes contradictory descriptions as well. I'll read some out later. And this highly condensed sea of adjectives makes the prose feel very thick, like you have to wade through it at times, which is brilliantly done when it causes an almost feverish atmosphere when Virgil is plagued by fever himself in the second part. And speaking of parts, the 4 different sections each have their own musicality as well. Water, the Arrival, the first one, is where Virgil arrives on the shore of Brundisium, where he's invited by Caesar Augustus. And what an outstanding opening this is. Even if you don't plan to read this book, you should at least check out the first 10, 20, 30, 40 opening pages in your library. They have a very tactile, synesthetic element almost. Fire, the Descent, is where Virgil is, as I mentioned, plagued by a fever in the night, creating a very restless reading experience. He sees drunk peasants on the street and is having all sorts of visions, which will appear in later parts again, and he starts to listen to death, to dying, and doubts the power of literature and the use of his project, of his Aeneid, of course. In Earth, the Expectation, Virgil then has a long-winded argument about the roles of art and society, and he tells the Caesar Augustus that he wants to burn his Aeneid, which the latter obviously does not. And Air, the Homecoming, is where Virgil finally leaves the realm of the living and enters a state of dying, where language finally reaches its limits and can only hint at what lies beyond it. People sometimes want to learn Russian to read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy in the original, or French to read Proust and Flaubert and so on. And if someone asked me which book I would recommend as one where the German language is utilized on such a high level unique to it, it might just be this book. What one should keep in mind too is that since it was written in 45 in exile, compared to both Berlin Alexanderplatz and Perugia, which were both published during the interwar period, German-speaking writers had to think about how it is still possible to write in the language that was used by the Nazis, that carried the propaganda, that was the tool of fascism, basically. And this is one of the key topics of the post-war writers in German-speaking countries, and I'm saying this to remind myself, not to make it sound like a pinnacle of pure language or whatever. Obviously, you can see Broch's experience and thoughts very much mirrored in the perspective of Virgil, the parallel of a culture about to die in the Augustan period, as well as Broch's own for a new one to emerge, or so is hope. Since the English translation was practically co-authored by Broch, it's a very good one and obviously approved by the author, but I still want to give you a sense of what the German feels like and compare to Jahnn's Untermeyer's translation. Unter den zu voller Helligkeit aufgeglommenen Sternschwärmen ruhte der Sonnenball in kalt-dunkler Röte, tief unten auf dem bleiern-goldenen Fluthorizont. Ja, fast hätte man glauben können, er sei schon hinabgetaucht und werde infolge einer ungewohnten Brechung des Lichts wieder heraufgespiegelt. Now the part The ball of the sun was resting coolly in a dark, reddish pool deep down on the watery horizon, leaden and golden together, would literally be something like the sunball rested in cold dark redness deep down on the leaden golden flood horizon. Of course, this doesn't make too much sense in English, but maybe you get the idea how packed and charged almost every descriptive element is. Now, I can completely understand anyone who says that the prose is beautiful, but too much, too heavy. In fact, I took such a long time to read it that I had to refuel my energy by reading other things on the side. But I feel like one might as well keep the book on the nightstand at all times and just read one sentence whenever the feeling is right for this specific beauty. It really is an outstanding accomplishment. Den Gang der Schöpfung übergellt das Kreischen stählerner Maschinen. Henny Jahnn was a farmer, organ builder, anti-nuclear activist, animal rights activist, pacifist, writer of course, horse breeder, dramatist, music publisher, founder of a utopian artist community. And after his death, he was buried in a coffin sealed with wax and covered with metal. And an interesting difference to Döblin and Broch, who both converted to Catholicism later on, is that he was a militant atheist, which played an important role in his writing. After I read The Death of Virgil, I wasn't really ready to read another big book, and I wanted to get used to Jahnn through his uncanny stories first. And I didn't know then that all of them were either included in Perugia or his magnum opus Fluss ohne Ufer, River Without Banks or Shortest River, of which the ship is the first part. And whereas I immediately thought this is exactly my thing, I love this when I encountered Broch's prose, while the text sometimes tried to build up resistance against me once I was in. Jahnn's prose initially felt a bit repellent, but once I got used to its construction, it sucked me right in. And I thought quite a bit about how I could describe my experience with Jahn's style, and these images might sound a bit weird, but they are the closest to how I felt. So sometimes the sentences felt like antique machines with an animal heart, or an animal with a machinic heart, so very constructed, very obviously constructed, but very much alive at the same time. And other times the prose felt like a frozen landscape, and each word like something like a rock crystal, not meant for a human to walk on, but very, very beautiful in itself, outside of any use for humans. But it's not that he writes cold and lifeless. In fact, there's this underlying force everywhere, a drive that is not just human. Maybe think of Schopenhauer's will, an all-encompassing drive, a lust. And once this old machine starts working for you, starts running, once you get used to his style and the book's heartbeat is finally in sync with yours as a reader, because, as I said, it's very much alive, then Jahn kind of crunches these word crystals against each other with a great mastery and control over them. And these undirected streams of passion, of life, death, animalistic, machinic, and later on in Perugia, financial, political, and militant too, they take you right in. And when I say undirected, I imply that, for example, the sexuality in Jahn's work is without any conventional restriction. Nothing is hidden. You read of affairs, prostitution, violence, even incest and sodomy. The literary critic Ulrich Greiner wrote a list with Jahn's 7 deadly sins, of which I'll cite a few. The first one is reduction of man. So Jahn knows that man is part of nature and not superior to the animal. Then there's his denial of morality. It's always secondary. And Jahn exposes what lies beneath morality. Now this doesn't mean that guilt doesn't exist, but that we simply do not know what man is in the first place. Jahn refuses sublimation. The greed and aggression are immediate. Man is body first, always body first, and only then perhaps spirit. So in Jahn's work, all conflicts are bodily conflicts, and all realizations are bodily realizations too. He did not take refuge in the metaphysical. There is no consolation. The question cannot be answered. And this might be the reason why his 2 big works, Perugia and River Without Banks, weren't finished. To quote Greiner, in very few works of art are language and content congruent. Not infrequently, and especially in the seemingly successful cases, such as Thomas Mann's, the language goes beyond its object, is overabundant, overdetermined, and tends to obscure and thicken the actual. In Jahn's case, it is the other way around. His language falls short of the claim to knowledge in such a way that the inaccessibility, the incomprehensibility of what is aimed at becomes conscious. The rational, intelligible, constructive side of speech and language does not reach the convulsive climaxes of the work. Perugia was published in 1929, and Jahn rewrote the first draft in 1927 after reading Ulysses, especially adding in a monologue. And elsewhere he inserts musical scores into his text, just as Joyce had done before him in Scylla and Charybdis and in Ithaca. And he catalogues items and enumerates names in long lists, much like Joyce had done in Cyclops and various other chapters. So Perugia was published the same year as Berlin Alexanderplatz, and Jahn reviewed Döblin's novel and pointed out similarities to Ulysses, and Döblin praised Perugia upon release. So both make use of very expressionistic language, of which I'm an absolute fan. And there's a nice image I found in Arno Schmidt's picture biography where Döblin and Jahn were the judges for a literary competition, and Schmidt was one of the winners. I believe an English translation for this is in the works, and there's too much I want to say about it and too little that I can to do it justice. So I read the beginning of Perugia, and if my own poor translation attempt can even in the slightest show what I meant with word crystals crunching, I hope I can get just a few more people to read him. just listen to the rhythm. Perodia aß seine Abendmahlzeit, Bissen nach Bissen, vorsichtig mit beinahe feister Gebärde. Die Hand schob in den Mund. Seine Zähne zermalmten das grobe Brot. Das regelmäßige Geräusch des brechenden Backwerks hinterließ ihm keine Befriedigung. Er aß. Es wäre vielleicht unterblieben, hätte eine leibliche Kraft, von der er nichts verstand, ihm nicht diktiert, dass ein Bedürfnis dafür vorliege. Eben jener Trieb zur Erhaltung, diese donnernde Lebensbejahung von Blut und Eingeweiden, die er zu leerem Schweigen erzogen hat. Once I finished the 13 uncanny stories, I immediately sunk my teeth into the ship. And this might be one of the best things I've ever read, and it's very short at the two, kind of an overture in which the themes of the whole trilogy are present. And because I wanted to live inside the Jahnn prose, even when I couldn't read, because I was walking outside or shopping or whatever, I got a radio play of his novella The Night of Lead, which has a pitch-black fever dream atmosphere. And I don't know if this makes much sense when I say it out loud, but since Jahnn has such a heavily bodily dimension to his writing, I felt like I wanted to have a signed copy of his too. This is just what he did to me. And in my defense, I'm not alone here. There's a nice anecdote about the writer Bodo Strauss, who was awarded the Büchnerpreis in 1989, the biggest literary prize in Germany, and he used the 60,000 mark prize money for basically a competition and told the public, read the 2,000 pages of this trilogy and write an essay about your impressions, to which 60 people were awarded 1,000 mark each. This alone should tell you a lot about Jahnn in general, and this one in particular. It has an incredible energy and tension. And one thing I admire is Jann's vividly brutal imagery to describe an inner fight, as in this case. Der Mann lächelte. Wertlose Fetzen, die von ihm abfallen werden, hält er sich krampfhaft gegen das angsttaumelnde Herz. Das Blut liegt ihm offen in den Lungen, und jappend bringt er die Luft, die chemische Außenwelt heran. Another great technique is that Jahnn, in his imagery, oscillates between staying close to the characters and their development of feelings, and then abruptly breaking the flow of the sentence to speak in almost biblical analogies. Gustav fühlte sich nicht so sehr als er selber, denn als das namenlose Schlachtvieh das Leben durch ein Tor hineingeht und danach unauffällig endet, schon ein zum Zerspalten bestimmter Gegenstand, wie es noch in seinen schönen Körpern unschuldig atmet, noch gemächlich wiederkäuende Rinder, deren Zukunft aus ist. Die würzigen Bissen gärenden Grases klumpen sich würgend in ihrem Schlunde, wenn eine Axt die Stirn trifft. And similarly, when the protagonist comes to a slow realization, Jahnn takes a step back and writes on a whole new scale. Da, wie ein violetter Blitz, reißt das Firmament in Fetzen. Schwarz brüllt es hinter dem Einbruch. Der Weltenraum wälzt sich mit einer unendlichen Kälte heran. Die Seele stürzt von der Erde ab. Das Lichtmeer trocknet aus. Sie sieht den Tod. Read Jahnn. Das Ziel der Schöpfung, die Dürre. I hope this video was at least of some interest to some and maybe even introduced a new name to you. And although they are pretty well-known names in literary circles, I would certainly hope more people read Döblin and Broch, and especially if you already do, make sure to check out Jahnn. Of course, these three writers were not the only German-speaking ones influenced by Joyce, and in the generation following them, there were the likes of Uwe Jonsson, known for his Jahrestage or anniversaries, Wolfgang Köppen and Wolfgang Hildesheimer, two writers that are barely ever talked about online, and of course Arno Schmidt, our dear friend with an ego as big as his books. So let me know if you can recommend other unappreciated German writers or experimental books in your language that too few people know about. Hope to see you around, take care and happy reading!